that.
Let me just say this to you, sir. Again, it is my time. 3,900 children were separated from their families.
450,000 kids were lost during the Biden
Mr.
administration.
Secretary,
You didn't say a word
Mr.
about
Secretary, do not interrupt.
Don't you point your finger at me. Don't
I
be
will
a hypocrite.
point my finger
Don't you
at
be a hypocrite
you.
then. Then you be as you should be as upset about the 450,000 kids that were lost. You didn't say a word about it. For 4 years, you never said a word.
Mr. Secretary.
A U.S. House Appropriations Subcommittee hearing devolved into a shouting match between Connecticut Democratic U.S. Representative Rosa DeLauro and Department of Homeland Security Secretary Markwayne Mullin. The Thursday hearing was supposed to examine the department's recent immigration policies, including migrant children separation. But as you saw there, the hearing escalated. Republicans have been highlighting the 95% reduction in illegal border crossings during the second Trump administration, which also overseen the deportation of self-removal of more than 2 million migrants who had been in the country illegally. During the former Biden administration, more than 14 million illegal entries were reported nationwide, according to reporting by the Center Square, including 2 million gotaways, those who evaded capture. Now, as a result, children were released to alleged gang members, human traffickers, non-family members, and sent to non-residential addresses. Federal Inspector General audits showing and a Florida grand jury found. The Center Square reporting on all of that. More than 300,000 of those children still unaccounted for, according to the U.S. Department of Justice. But it's not just the human trafficking that's raising concerns from the previous administration's handling of the border. There's also the public safety component of fentanyl trafficking. And recent 19-year DEA veteran has blown the whistle on the previous administration's handling of those fentanyl investigations. Now, joining us here with the states to discuss this further is Empower Oversight President Tristan Levitt. Tristan, thanks for taking time with us here. And tell us about David Howell.
David is as you mentioned, very experienced DEA veteran, and he has been in New Mexico his entire career. And at a certain point, he recognized that things were really going off the rails. Back in 2019, the Trump Justice Department put out new protocols that were related to how DEA and other law enforcement agents should respond if they're up on a wiretap and they hear talk of trafficking fentanyl. And those protocols were modeled after protocols. You and I have talked before about my work on Operation Fast and Furious 15 years ago. The work there that Congress did resulted in protocols for firearms trafficking, and fentanyl was deemed to be so dangerous that it was added to this category. That if you hear of it, you have to try and stop it, unlike other types of drugs where DEA routinely lets shipments go in an effort to identify further up the chain. So when David Howell noticed that the U.S. Attorney's Office was starting to tell them, no, don't stop these shipments, he spoke up about it. In some cases, he seized it anyway. The U.S. Attorney's Office got upset with him. And so he ended up going on somewhat of a journey where for some months he filed with various government agencies to try and draw attention to this and to ensure that people could understand why this was such a problem. So this has now become public through an AP story, and we're glad that the public has the chance to hear for themselves what the DEA was doing.
Yeah, and when you mentioned Fast and Furious, that was one of the first things I read or thought when I was reading about this, and just the idea of this tactic of walking illicit materials to essentially what is this tactic about? Explain that so people fully understand why law enforcement is allowing fentanyl, or in Fast and Furious, the guns to walk.
So in both instances, you've kind of got two related and similar motivations or concerns. So the first is a desire to go beyond just the lowest level individuals there. So in Fast and Furious, they had this goal that they're going to somehow take down the trafficking cartels, the drug cartels. And I think there's a similar motivation with fentanyl, and saying you can hear the former Biden U.S. Attorney Alex Ubalez has been speaking pretty openly about how their office pushed this. And they are saying, well, we needed to do it to catch more people than the lower level. The second kind of motivation is there's an element of it's difficult to get up on a wiretap, a federal wiretap. So once they are, law enforcement tends to want to obviously you want to preserve the wire, but there's a tension in law enforcement who are saying, don't do anything at all. If we seize this stuff, they'll know that we're onto them, versus saying, no, there are lots of ways that you can seize these materials and not have it tip off the wire, such as by having local law enforcement do the stop. You can make it a traffic stop. Looks like you were going a little faster than you should have. You got a tail light out or something else like that. There are lots of ways that law enforcement can stop a car, seize what's inside of it without revealing that there's a wiretap open.
Now, Tristan, Fast and Furious obviously was a huge scandal years ago. People just now tuning in politically may not remember that, but I mean, that led to somebody being shot and killed, another law enforcement officer being shot and killed with one of those guns, correct?
That's right. And in fact, the reality is many, many, many people were shot and killed with them, but the vast majority were south of the U.S. border. And so most Americans didn't take notice until Border Patrol agent Brian Terry died on the night of December 15th, 2010. And at that scene were recovered 2 weapons that trace back to Fast and Furious. And that's what motivated John Dodson, the original whistleblower, to come forward. That's what really brought attention to that scandal. And that was actually the beginning of my working with whistleblowers, because I was so impressed with John and his conviction and courage and saying he needed to speak up about this.
But fast forward to today, fentanyl is considered even by President Donald Trump as like a weapon of war. Is this not rising to the level of where people are a little concerned with this tactic of walking dangerous drugs onto the streets?
Well, you've got a disconnect here. Within the DEA and the U.S. Attorney's Office, they don't seem to have seen the issue. Some did, to be clear. David Howell was not the only one, and others have spoken up. The AP article that made this public also interviewed a DEA supervisor who has retired, and he identified that well beyond what the trafficking, the walking that David knew about. He said he watched a vehicle with 1.8 million fentanyl pills, but was told by the U.S. Attorney's Office to stand down and not seize them. So within the agency, there was this mindset. But what David has said from the time I met him was, once the public finds out about this, they will be outraged. We can talk all we want about bigger cases and tactics, this and that, but this is a situation where the public had their lives put at stake. And so the disconnect you see with the Albuquerque mayor, with the governor of New Mexico speaking up about it, right? Speaking up about Biden administration policies. You don't see that kind of Democrat speaking against Democrat policies very often. But I think the public is very, very alarmed now that this has all become a matter of public concern.
So David puts out he blows the whistle on this. There's a report done. What did the DOJ's Office of Professional Regulation and Responsibility say ultimately about David's report?
They really circled the wagons. So the process that this goes through that required them to do a report is the Office of Special Counsel, an agency that I previously led, and they have a function where if you make a whistleblower disclosure, if they think it meets an important enough threshold and is likely to be true allegations, they send it to the agency and require a report. DOJ in 2024 under the Biden administration really circled the wagons and said, well, we believe that this 2019 protocol gave discretion, even though the protocol specifically said if you become aware on a wiretap of trafficking, you need to take all practicable steps to stop it. And they said, well, it says practicable. That implies that, it's reasonable. So that means you could not do it also, right? It's totally illogical. And so they argued that about the past policy, but at the same time, they also put out a new policy that specifically gives discretion. And so they basically blew off the concerns that David expressed. And OSC's procedures are to make that report public, redacted names, redacted information there. For instance, they redacted the word protocol, which sounds a lot more formal than just what they said, guidance. But an AP reporter saw that put out on OSC's website, and that's how he wanted to try and track down David. He realized they failed to redact a letter from David's name and asked around until he got in touch. And David said, well, it's a risk to my career, but I am willing to speak up about this because I think it really harms American lives.
Again, the president's referred to fentanyl as a weapon of mass destruction. Is the Trump administration doing enough to not just address the fentanyl issue and the border issue, as we opened up with the exchange in Congress earlier this week, but is he doing enough to help whistleblowers?
Well, we've had a very positive response working with the Trump administration on whistleblowers. A number of our FBI clients, we were able to successfully settle their cases. Our IRS whistleblowers on the Hunter Biden case were elevated and promoted by Secretary Scott Bessent, and so they are now senior leaders at the IRS. So we have seen very positive response to the clients that had blown the whistle that we've helped. What we do think is important at this time is that they look down deeper into the agency at the DEA. There's kind of a reflexive instinct by agency heads, such as Administrator Cole at the DEA, to say, well, these are my people, these allegations must not be true. But so the DEA has now called for an inspector general investigation. We think it's important that they not wait for the results of that before reversing the 2024 change that gutted the fentanyl protocols. I think that's an important step for the Trump administration to take. They've already been very proactive in targeting cartels and going after fentanyl. And this is one more thing that will be very important to ensure that other offices around the country aren't also using this same tactic once the Biden DOJ told them it was okay.
Tristan Levitt, president of Empower Oversight, thank you so much for joining the states to break this story down further. Meanwhile, a record of U.S. Border Patrol agents now serving under President Donald Trump. The Center Square contributor Bethany Blankley reporting, as of this spring, 21,000 Border Patrol agents now serving. U.S. Customs and Border Protection saying Wednesday this is the highest staffing level in U.S. Border Patrol's 102-year history. CBP's fiscal 2026 budget is about $23 billion, roughly the same as its fiscal 25 budget. And speaking of border security and immigration policy, asylum seekers who are arriving at the border are not entitled to entry. And the Department of Homeland Security has broad authority over the Temporary Protected Status Program. That's according to the U.S. Supreme Court in 2 separate cases ruled on Thursday. Read more about those at thecentersquare.com.